Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Simpatico Studios, where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on simpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey adapters, today our guest is Dr. Ruth DeFries. Ruth is a professor of ecology and sustainable development at Columbia University. She has a big picture view of how humans and nature are intertwined and enjoys translating complex ideas into popular writings. Ruth is a MacArthur Genius recipient and has received many other awards for her scientific achievements. In her upcoming book, Ruth argues that nature provides a model for resilience to unpredictable shocks. She shares the 4 key strategies that nature employs to be resilient to shocks and how human societies could benefit if leaders adopted these strategies in business and government institutions. Hey, Ruth, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Doug. Great to be here.
All right, so I'm looking forward to this conversation. This is one of those kind of, philosophical, and I really love having these conversations. And so first off, though, you are at Columbia University and the Earth Institute. Could you give a little bit of background of, what that is?
That's right. So the Earth Institute is designed to address our planetary problems in sustainability and how humans can prosper and have a healthy planet at the same time. And the Earth Institute is a place where just colleagues from so many different areas, whether it's engineering, physics, economics, law, policy, public health, from all of these fields that are so important to address our big planetary problems, can come together and work collaboratively.
In my own experience with the Earth Institute, it's like a murder's row of experts. You guys are just doing some amazing work, and people, when you talk climate change, you're looking at Columbia University have been doing a lot longer than other universities. And so I'm always impressed with what you guys are doing. All right, so let's start with a big question. It seems that the world's getting more uncertain and unpredictable. Is this true?
Well, yes and no. So the pandemic has revealed how fragile we are, how our human institutions are just so fragile when they're challenged with a shock like the pandemic. So we are quite used to coming out of the 20th century with all our technological wizardry to fixing problems, finding a problem, getting a vaccine overnight, some technology that's going to fix our problem. And what we're learning in the 21st century is that the world is such a complex place. Civilization is so complex that all this technology and know-how is fantastic and has gotten us very far, but we have to learn how to live in an unpredictable world. So one of the aspects that makes our world more unpredictable, full of surprises, is that we are so interconnected. So if we, for instance, had a disease emerge when the world was less connected, it would be more likely to die out in a local place. But we're so interconnected that a disease can just spread and cause a worldwide pandemic. So you think about that with the flow of ideas and social media and trade and all of these ways that we are so connected in our modern civilization. That makes us into what scientists call a complex adaptive system, which means always changing and evolving and non-linearities and feedbacks and essentially unpredictable and full of surprises. Now you add climate change on top of that and all the unpredictability and the likelihood of emergence of diseases as humans go into places where they haven't been before. You put all that together and we live in a pretty unpredictable, uncertain world.
Well, I'm sure there's going to be some amazing books and studies coming out of what happened with the pandemic. And you think like this whole notion of being interconnected, the pandemic can move around quickly around the world. It's how we travel. But at the same time, I guess maybe some positives too is that when I read, as doctors and researchers are sharing therapies for the pandemic, that these are quickly getting out. If you think about the virus in 1918, that kind of information sharing wasn't happening, but this can happen relatively quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. So this interconnectedness, it has a lot of positives, a lot of sharing of ideas, sharing of technology, diffusion, which can be absolutely beneficial, but it also can make us very fragile. So the thinking, what I was trying to think about in the book was how do you recognize that this complexity that we live in is both a fantastic opportunity and benefit, but also brings fragility and danger. So how do we construct our society, our networks, our human institutions to best guard against, to take what's good and guard against the dangerous parts of that interconnectedness?
Okay, so you mentioned your book. Let's just jump right into it. And so your book, What Would Nature Do? Could you give us some? This hasn't even come out yet, but it's coming out soon. And what's the published date?
December 1st.
Okay, so it's just right around the corner. Great. And all right, so in the book, one of the things that you argue is that nature can provide a model for resilience to unpredictable shocks. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so nature, if you think of life on Earth, has survived for billions of years, survived through asteroids crashing into the Earth, survived through extinctions and diseases and swings in climate, and those are all unpredictable surprise events. They might not be unpredictable that they would happen at some time, but it's unpredictable when they would happen. So nature has developed, or evolution has developed, ways to persist through that uncertainty. And if it were not so, then any of these surprise events could have made life on Earth extinct. So these strategies are, for example, a ginkgo leaf. If you think about a ginkgo leaf, it's the oldest, one of the oldest trees in evolution. And it has a leaf vein structure, which is very efficient. It has branches that carry water and carry sugars, which is what leaf veins need to do, in a very efficient way. It just branches out. But if you look at how then leaf veins evolved over time, if you pick up a leaf vein next time when you go outside, you can pick up a leaf and you will see that it has a lot of loopy leaf veins, a lot of redundancy in that network of veins that carry water and sugar and make it possible for the plant to survive. Now that's inefficient from a plant's point of view. It has to invest in building that network structure, but evolution, shows that inefficiency pays off. If you think about what happens to a leaf if it gets bitten by a insect, then you need a way to have a redundant network strategy, and that's what a leaf vein, this looping network in leaf vein, shows. So if we look to that example of nature, that investment in redundancy, even though it's not the most efficient strategy, pays off. And we're seeing that. You think about how that pays off in trade networks or communication networks. And we're learning, and there's been a lot of discussion in this from the pandemic about how fragile our trade networks are when they are efficient, but fragile because they don't have that kind of redundancy. So it's those kinds of strategies, these kind of systems level strategies in nature that I was trying to find in the book and think about how they might apply to the decisions we make to conduct our affairs in human civilization.
So you'd mentioned, I think that's just one you were kind of walking through, but there's four of them that the four key ones. Can you kind of just go through those really quickly?
Yeah, sure. So there's four, as you said. One is the architecture of networks that we just discussed. So when we have a network where we need to have goods and ideas and everything flowing, to build redundancy in those networks. But when we have networks where we want to cut them off like the spread of disease, to have modular kinds of networks where you could cut off a whole part of the network. And that's exactly what social insects do, because they are very vulnerable to pandemics going through through the nest and wiping them out. But it doesn't happen all that often because they design their social networks to have this modular structure. So this idea of how the architecture of our networks to be resilient to the threats. So that's one. A second one is diversity. So we know, and our nature is much celebrated for the diversity and the types of plants and animals that we have in the world, and the varieties of different species, and that's what really keeps our options open. That is our library of options. So if there is a disease that wipes out one species, there will be another that can move into that space. So that's also investment in keeping diversity is a key strategy of nature. A third one is the idea of bottom-up decisions. So you will never find in nature, or at least I can't think of an example in nature where you have a sort of central control. We might think of a queen bee or a queen in an ant's nest, but that queen really has very little power. That queen is not directing ants where to go, or making the decisions about what path the ant should follow to carry food back to the nest. So these examples from nature show us, or suggest to us, that the making decisions from the bottom up, where the people or individuals who are closest to the ground and have the information on the ground about their local surrounding, it can lead to effective decisions, more effective than a central command and control. And we've certainly seen that in economies, and we can talk about other examples. Fourth strategy is the idea of self-correcting mechanisms. Nature is full of self-correcting mechanisms, or we might think of them as negative feedbacks that self-correct. So, for example, insulin in human physiology, where our bodies through hormones regulate blood sugar, or you think about at a grand global scale the cycling of carbon that moves around from the atmosphere to the solid earth to the oceans, and that is just the most elegant example of a self-correcting mechanism which allows climate to stay fairly stable over the course of Earth history. And without that, we would not be here to talk about this today. So those kind of self-correcting features is another important strategy of nature, and we can discuss how those apply to, might or might not apply to human civilization.
Okay, so as you were describing those, I was thinking, especially that the biodiversity one is really good. It's just, do you have these rhetorical conversations? Because you basically described a more utilitarian version of environmentalism. And so people are out there talking about the intrinsic value of biodiversity, and quite frankly, especially in the United States, most people don't really care about that. So I think it makes for a poor argument. But what you're describing, we're going to be a more stable society. We're going to be a more highly functioning society if we kind of mirror what's going on in nature. And do you find that you get caught up in those conversations of like, okay, and what I'm getting at is like, people say, oh, you love nature and all that. And it's just, that's not, a lot of people can't relate to that. But what you just described, it seems like a much easier argument to, I guess, promote environmentalism.
Yeah, I mean, I love nature.
Sure, so
I think there is intrinsic value to every form of life, but that's not what this book is about. This book is about what we can learn from nature's strategies. So it's a very human-centric kind of question. What can we take from nature strategies, which have evolved over billions of years, facing uncertainties, unpredictable events, all, this type of unpredictability that human civilization faces. And what can we learn from those strategies? So it's very unabashedly human centric, not to preserve nature, which I believe in strongly, but that's not what this is about. This is about what can we learn from nature for our own construction of our institutions and how we run civilization.
And I'm with you. I love nature and I love biodiversity, but I also hang around other people and they don't care about those things in the same way. And so that the notion of that we should value it for very different reasons. If that gets you more traction to do these things, I think that's a really good thing. All right, so I want to go back to this term, unpredictable shocks. Talking about resilience to unpredictable shocks, and when it comes to climate change, even though there's going to be a lot of unpredictable things happening out there, but do you think it's really going to unfold as unpredictable? It seems like a lot of things that are unfolding with climate change, it's just like the scientists are like, well, we saw this coming. Would you say climate change lends itself to the idea of unpredictable shocks?
Well, I think the sort of major impact of increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is known, predictable. It's been known for a century. That is not surprising that increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere leads to generally a warmer world. But all of the cascading impacts that come from that climate change, a lot of unpredictability is inherent, especially in the biological realm, in terms of pests, in terms of impacts on our food system. A lot of where there's such an interconnected web of interactions that happen, and these complex systems, that's where we can expect some unpredictability. Even in the most, what seemed like the most predictable kinds of impacts of climate change, melting ice, the story isn't different, that increasing greenhouse gases leads to melting of ice. But the understanding of that has unfolded in ways that even a decade ago, scientists were not thinking about, melting even faster than predicted. So I think there's a lot of surprises in store. Although the major climate change, that increasing greenhouse gases leads to changing climate, that's not surprising, and that is quite predictable. But most unpredictable is the way that human institutions respond. So take, for example, there was a spike in food prices in 2011 because there were some droughts in some food producing regions, which reduced production and increased prices. Okay, that's predictable. But all of that was exacerbated by the human decisions around that for producing countries to restrict their exports, which further escalated prices, which further led to food riots around the world. And some people say quite convincingly that food price spike was a factor in Arab Spring, which then cascaded to change, geopolitics. So the way that all of these events, which might be triggered by climate change, unfold through nature and through our human responses, I think we have a lot of surprises in store.
Okay, I obviously haven't read the book yet; it hasn't come out. But who do you want to read this? Obviously, this is recommendations. Society should learn how nature does things. Like, what is your aspirational sort of expectations? Like, who should kind of read this book, and how does it actually lead to change that you're recommending?
Well, I tried to make the book fun to read. And you can be the judge of that by including a lot of stories and, try not to be too sciencey and geeky. So hopefully it's fun to read. But what I was aiming at was for people who think a lot about the future and the present and how we organize ourselves as a society, to think about how we might incorporate these kinds of strategies. So while an individual can't, build a seed bank or protect an endangered language, or construct a redundant global food trade network. Those are out of the realm of sort of our individual capabilities. What we can do is support the leaders who have this kind of thinking about how we can build resiliency into our society. We can make decisions about what are the, or through our leaders, about what are the investments we should be making, for example, in seed banks, which keeps the diversity alive for our food crops, and to just appreciate where we might be going as a society, what types of leaders we need and what types of investments we might be able to make to improve our resiliency and increase our immunity to really damaging outcomes from these kinds of surprising events like we're seeing from the pandemic. So I don't know if that's a very satisfactory answer, because a lot of these things really are out of individual control, but society's made up of individuals, and the leaders that we support and the investments that we signal to our leaders are the ones that society should be making.
Well, it occurred to me sort of the irony of the situation that, let's say someone wants to scale up what you're proposing, like the four ways, we can learn from nature. You're actually going to have to master sort of a human thing, politics, right? It's sort of a human like built thing is going to get you to the nature-based approaches, because unless you master that political realm, you're not going to get any closer. So I thought that was kind of bittersweet. We've got some questions and comments in the chat room I want to get to. We're getting toward the end of the episode. This is blown by. Sarah said, and she's got some comments, but then there's a question. Just curious if Ruth has heard of the yellow blob on display at the Paris Zoological Park that planners have become interested in to help model transportation networks. And she created a link. Essentially, it spreads itself out over its food source and creates many nutrient pathways. And she says, if you've heard of the yellow blob, would you consider this an example of what we're talking about here today?
Oh, well, I haven't heard specifically about the yellow blob, but I think what Sarah is referring to is the slime mold, the way a slime mold grows. A slime mold is a organism that reaches out to construct this incredible network to be able to capture food sources. At one point, I had written a whole thing about slime mold to put into the book, but it didn't make it into the final version. But it is so fascinating about how a slime mold reaches out and then contracts. But the interesting thing is contracts its tentacles to be able to reach different food sources. And the interesting thing is that when there have been experiments done, that when there is some sort of obstacle put in the way of that network, that the slime mold can quickly find another route that it had explored previously to a food source, echoing this idea of leaf veins and keeping some redundancy in networks if one part of the network gets damaged. So I will check that out, Sarah. Thank you.
I love just hearing about evolution. Mike's question is, what are some ways we can change or replace some of our current infrastructure to be less vulnerable to these climate shocks? What is some of the low-hanging fruit that could change right now?
Yeah, well, one low-hanging fruit is about our food systems. And we have become, or the world's food supply for humanity has become so dependent on a handful of crops: rice, wheat, maize. A very small number of crops provide a majority of the calories that humans consume. And while that has been very efficient, it also is, it sets us up for being vulnerable when we have climate-induced or pest-induced damages to our food supply. So keeping diversity in our food supply, I think, is a really low-hanging fruit. Also, along the lines of food systems, we have the way the global food trade has evolved is to be very concentrated. So there are a few hubs that supply many countries. So improving some redundancy in that supply chain is also a low-hanging fruit. There's also things like, the keeping languages alive, keeping different worldviews alive, which is hard to do in our culture, which tends to be, to favor homogeneity, but to invest in those kinds of um, diversity, even though it might not seem efficient, and you never know when it might come in handy. But that I think is a real low hanging fruit.
When you were just describing how these systems kind of work, inefficiencies and redundancies is just like strategies that nature take. First thing that came to my mind is the Department of Defense. A lot of the ways how they sort of operate, and I bet some folks they're going to find your book. I bet the people there, if you look at government, I bet the DoD is going to be one of the first people that are like, you know what, we got to think more like this. I bet they take advantage of what you're saying.
It's funny you say that, Doug, because there is a story in the book about about Paul Barron, who is a father of the internet, and he proposed a redundant leaf network-like strategy during the Cold War, and he was laughed out of the room from the Defense Department and the AT&T. Over time, the developers of the internet rediscovered that strategy, and that's the basis for the internet today.
Well, I predict you're gonna find out that showing up somewhere in the Pentagon, your book's gonna show up on, and they're like, all right, this is how as they approach climate change, they're gonna be like, we need to think about things differently. So we'll see. You want EPA or someone to sort of take it over, but we're at the end of the episode. This has been fabulous. I would love actually to have more conversations. You just scratched the surface on a few topics that we could talk about again. I know you're a very busy professor, but I'd love to extend an invitation, when your schedule permits, to come have these conversations. But this has been fantastic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Doug.
I want to bring you to just chatting to close out the episode, but we sort of officially close it out. But just hold on just a second. I'll be right back.
Okay.